The sun had just slipped behind the Wasatch Mountains, painting the sky in streaks of violet and orange, when the first sharp cracks split the air. Students who had been chatting on the library steps froze in confusion, unsure if the noise was fireworks or something far more sinister. Within seconds, the screams began. Books fell, phones clattered to the pavement, and the once peaceful quad erupted into chaos. At the center of the commotion lay Alexander Price, a prominent conservative influencer whose fiery speeches and viral online presence had made him both a champion to his followers and a lightning rod of controversy to his critics. He had arrived on campus earlier that day to deliver a lecture on free speech, and though the event was over, clusters of students lingered nearby, some waiting for autographs, others continuing heated debates sparked by his words. Few could have imagined that the evening would end in violence. The gunfire came in 3 sharp bursts, echoing off the stone buildings and sending panicked students diving behind benches, cars, and low walls. Alexander staggered, clutching his chest, before collapsing onto the cold pavement. Blood pooled quickly beneath him, illuminated by the fading light and the glow of nearby lampposts. His security detail, caught off guard, rushed to shield him, shouting into radios for immediate backup. The sound of footsteps thundered in every direction as hundreds of young people fled the quad, some crying, others too stunned to even look back. "I didn't know what was happening, I just ran," said one sophomore, her hands trembling as she described the moment later to reporters. Everyone was screaming. People fell down the stairs trying to get away. It felt like the world was ending. The shooter, whose figure had been glimpsed by only a handful of witnesses, moved swiftly through the chaos. A hood obscured most of his face, and the shadows of the evening made him nearly indistinguishable. One student claimed to have seen a flash of metal before the attacker disappeared into the thicket of trees bordering the science building. Within minutes, he was gone. No one could tell if he had escaped by car, on foot, or was still lurking somewhere nearby. Campus police arrived almost instantly, their sirens slicing through the night, but their presence did little to calm the frenzy. Officers shouted for students to take cover indoors, their rifles raised as they scanned the surrounding lawns and rooftops. Ambulances pushed through the crowd, paramedics kneeling by Alexander's side as his chest rose and fell erratically. "Stay with us, sir," one of them repeated desperately, applying pressure to the wound, as another shouted for more gauze. But even in the glow of flashing red and blue lights, it was clear to those watching that the situation was slipping away. Word spread like wildfire. Within 20 minutes, the first social media posts surfaced, grainy videos of people sprinting across the quad, shaky phone footage of Alexander lying motionless, captions filled with shock and disbelief. By the time national outlets picked up the story, hashtags related to the shooting had already climbed to the top of trending lists. Friends of the slain influencer texted each other frantically, trying to confirm what they were seeing online. Parents of students flooded the university's hotline, desperate for updates on whether their children were safe. Back on campus, fear was contagious. Some students huddled in dorm rooms, lights off, whispering about whether the gunman was still nearby. Others streamed live on their phones, documenting the sirens, the cordoned-off areas, and the helicopters that began circling overhead. One freshman later admitted that he locked himself in a bathroom stall, knees pulled to his chest, too terrified to move. "It didn't feel real," he said. "Like something out of a movie, except it was happening to us." For Alexander Price, however, the scene was no longer surreal but final. Despite the frantic efforts of paramedics, despite the sirens and the shouts and the desperate calls for a medevac, his pulse faded beneath their hands. When the pronouncement came, whispered first among officers and then confirmed by officials, the atmosphere shifted from chaos to shock. Students cried openly on the sidewalks. Supporters fell to their knees in disbelief. Protesters who had earlier clashed with him stood frozen, the reality of death erasing the lines of ideology, at least for the moment. As his body was lifted onto a stretcher and covered, the crowd fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of helicopters overhead. The once vibrant campus quad, filled just hours before with spirited debate, had become the scene of a national tragedy. A lone megaphone lay abandoned on the steps, its plastic shell cracked, a silent reminder of the speech that had sparked the gathering. Police quickly expanded their search perimeter, officers moving door to door, checking buildings and cars, urging anyone with information to come forward. Descriptions of the shooter varied wildly. Some said he was tall, others swore he was of average build, some remembered a dark jacket, others claimed it was light gray. What united them all was the image of a faceless figure, slipping away like smoke into the night. Reporters swarmed the campus within an hour, their bright lights and cameras clashing with the grim expressions of students still wrapped in shock blankets. Interviews replayed on repeat across national networks, the shaking voices of those who had heard the shots, the disbelief of professors who had welcomed Alexander onto campus, the weary words of law enforcement urging patience as the manhunt began. By midnight, the campus was locked down, students forbidden to leave their dorms as police and FBI agents flooded the scene. Roads were blocked, checkpoints established, and every car leaving the area was inspected. Still, the shooter remained out of reach, his motives unknown, his escape route uncertain. Fear lingered like smoke in the air, heavy and suffocating. For the community, the shooting was not just a crime, but a shattering of normalcy. The quiet quad where students once studied under the trees had become stained with memory, a place people would remember not for lectures or laughter, but for the night their sense of safety was ripped away. And for the nation watching from afar, the image of a conservative voice silenced so violently was both symbol and warning, that words, however powerful, could make someone a target, and that even on a peaceful campus in Utah, tragedy could arrive in the blink of an eye. Understood. Since we're working with a fictionalized story for practice, I'll expand Scene 2 into about 1,000 words, keeping it realistic, immersive, and written as a narrative without headings. Shockwaves rippled through the campus long after the gunfire ceased. For hours, students gathered in small clusters, whispering in disbelief, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. The death of Alexander Price had already exploded onto social media, carried across platforms in shaky videos, captions typed through tears, and hashtags that spread with the speed of wildfire. Within minutes of the tragedy, the quiet Utah campus had become the focus of national attention, its lawns and buildings frozen in the frame of millions of screens. The first reaction came from those closest to the scene. Friends of Price, young conservatives who had helped organize his campus appearance, sat huddled together near the library, their faces streaked with tears, their voices barely audible. Some clutched the red pamphlets that had been distributed earlier during his lecture, their crumpled edges now damp with sweat. "He came here to talk about free speech," one supporter said softly, staring at the ground. "And now he's gone. Just like that." Not far away, those who had protested his visit wrestled with their own shock. Some of them had spent the afternoon chanting outside the auditorium, holding signs and debating heatedly with Price's supporters. Yet the suddenness of violence blurred the lines of ideology. A student who had argued against Price's views hours earlier now spoke with a trembling voice. "I disagreed with everything he stood for, but I never imagined this. I feel sick knowing I was just steps away when it happened." By the next morning, a spontaneous vigil had formed. Hundreds of candles flickered across the campus lawn, their flames trembling in the autumn breeze. Flowers, handwritten notes, and posters began to pile up near the steps of the library, transforming the site of tragedy into a memorial. Students stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, their expressions heavy with grief. Some prayed quietly, others sang hymns, and many simply stared at the ground, trying to process the enormity of what had unfolded before them. Across the country, reactions poured in. Conservative leaders and commentators flooded television networks, praising Alexander Price as a bold voice silenced too soon. They described him as fearless, uncompromising, and willing to face hostile crowds in defense of his beliefs. Some framed his death as an attack not only on him personally, but on the values he championed. His allies promised to honor his memory by continuing his fight. Critics, meanwhile, were more restrained but no less shaken. Even those who had long opposed his rhetoric condemned the violence, stressing that no political disagreement justified bloodshed. Prominent figures from across the ideological spectrum posted messages of shock and condolences, a rare moment of unity in a deeply divided landscape. But as the hours passed, the initial wave of grief gave way to something else: speculation. On social media, theories about the shooter's motives spread rapidly. Some insisted it was an act of political revenge, others argued it was random violence, and still others claimed it was staged or exaggerated. Hashtags became battlegrounds as mourners clashed with skeptics and conspiracy theorists. The grief that had united people in the immediate aftermath now fractured into arguments about what the tragedy meant, who was responsible, and what would come next. News networks dispatched teams to the Utah campus, their vans and satellite dishes lining the streets, their anchors speaking solemnly against the backdrop of candlelight vigils. They interviewed professors who had taught Price during his own college years, former colleagues who remembered his early rise in media, and students who described the terror of hearing gunshots so close. The coverage was relentless, and soon the tragedy was not just a local or national story. It had become a global one, debated in headlines from Europe to Asia. Inside the university, administrators scrambled to balance mourning with security. The president of the institution gave a somber address, calling Price's death a devastating loss that will mark our community for years. Classes were canceled for the week, counseling services were expanded, and armed patrols were stationed at every entrance. Yet none of these measures erased the fear that still gripped the campus. Many students packed their bags and went home, unable to concentrate on academics in the shadow of such violence. Among Price's followers, grief was often mingled with anger. In online forums and private groups, many demanded answers, convinced that the shooting was politically motivated. Some pointed fingers at protest groups, accusing them of creating a hostile environment that led to the attack. Others argued that law enforcement had failed to protect him, despite warnings about threats he had received in the days leading up to his appearance. They let him walk right into danger, one supporter fumed. They should have done more. They knew he had enemies. The sense of outrage extended beyond his immediate circle. Conservative organizations announced plans for rallies and tributes, promising to transform grief into activism. In their statements, they described Price as a martyr, someone who had paid the ultimate price for speaking his mind. His speeches, once controversial, were now shared widely as symbols of defiance. Clips of him warning about threats to free expression resurfaced, gaining millions of views, framed as eerie premonitions of his fate. Yet amid the political firestorm, the students who had witnessed the tragedy struggled simply to cope. One sophomore, who had been standing only yards away when the shots rang out, described how she could still hear the sound in her dreams. "I see his face every time I close my eyes," she whispered. "It doesn't feel real. I keep thinking I'll wake up and it won't have happened." Faculty members echoed that sentiment, many expressing disbelief that their quiet campus had become the site of such horror. Professors canceled lectures, instead inviting students to share their thoughts and fears in open forums. Some faculty called for unity and dialogue, hoping the tragedy could become a catalyst for healing rather than division. Others admitted privately that they feared the opposite, that Price's death would deepen the fractures already tearing at the country. For law enforcement, the hours after the tragedy were consumed by the hunt for the gunman. Officials offered only vague descriptions of the suspect, unwilling to confirm details until they were certain. Still, their reassurances did little to quell the tension. Rumors of sightings spread like wildfire, with students reporting shadows in alleyways, strangers lurking in parking lots, and unknown cars idling on quiet streets. Each report brought fresh waves of panic, though none proved to be the shooter. As night fell again on the campus, the memorial grew. Candles flickered in the wind, their wax pooling onto the concrete steps. Names and messages were scrawled across posters, many of them repeating the same words: "Gone too soon." For some, the vigil was a way to grieve. For others, it was a way to stand guard against forgetting. But for everyone gathered there, the silence spoke louder than any speech. In that silence, The enormity of what had happened began to settle in. A voice that had filled auditoriums, dominated debates, and ignited passions on both sides was suddenly gone. And though the investigation pressed forward and the search for the suspect stretched into another day, the community understood that the loss was not just of a man, but of the fragile sense of safety that once defined their campus. Understood. I'll continue the fictional narrative and expand Scene 3 to about 1,000 words, immersive and atmospheric, without using headings. Night descended heavy and restless over Utah, and with it came the growing unease of a community living in fear. The helicopters had not stopped circling since dusk, their blades chopping rhythmically through the cold air, their spotlights sweeping over rooftops and parking lots. Streets that usually bustled with students and families were now deserted, the only movement coming from patrol cars creeping through neighborhoods, their red and blue lights flashing in silence. Inside their homes, residents peered from behind curtains, whispering nervously about whether the gunman might be hiding nearby. Every unfamiliar noise seemed sharper, every shadow darker, as though danger itself were breathing just outside. The police presence was overwhelming. Dozens of officers in tactical gear fanned out across the campus and surrounding blocks, rifles slung across their chests, radios crackling with urgent chatter. Command posts were set up at intersections, where detectives huddled over maps and laptops, trying to piece together the suspect's escape route. The few eyewitness accounts they had were inconsistent, and grainy surveillance footage offered little more than a blurred outline disappearing into the night. The shooter was a phantom, someone who had managed to pull off an assassination in plain sight and vanish without leaving a clear trace. As the search dragged on, the weight of uncertainty settled deeper on the town. Students who had locked themselves in their dorms hours earlier now sat in dimly lit rooms, glued to their phones, watching every update unfold on news apps and social media feeds. Some wept quietly, shaken by memories of the chaos on the quad. Others texted their parents reassuring words they didn't believe themselves. A few recorded video diaries, their voices breaking as they tried to capture the surreal terror of being caught in the middle of a manhunt. "They told us to stay inside," one freshman whispered into her camera. "But it feels like the walls can't protect us. Whoever did this is still out there. What if they come back?" For law enforcement, the hunt was a race against time. The longer the gunman remained at large, the more panic spread. Officers knocked on doors, questioned residents, and checked basements, garages, and abandoned buildings. Canine units sniffed through wooded areas near the edge of campus, their handlers straining to keep up. Drones hovered above, transmitting heat signatures to ground teams. Yet each promising lead evaporated into nothing. It was as if the shooter had melted into the night, leaving behind only fear. At a hastily arranged press conference just before midnight, the police chief appeared grim, his voice measured but strained. He confirmed that the suspect had not been caught, urged the community to remain indoors, and assured them that every resource was being deployed to bring the attacker to justice. His words, though steady, did little to calm the raw nerves of those watching. Many residents heard only the one fact that mattered: the killer was still free. Beyond the immediate fear, questions about motive began to consume public discussion. Was it a political act, a calculated strike against a figure whose words stirred fierce debate? Or was it something more personal, a vendetta hidden behind the anonymity of a mask and a gun? Without answers, speculation filled the void. Cable news panels buzzed with theories, their talking heads arguing late into the night. On social media, the narrative split in 100 directions, each more urgent and insistent than the last. Some blamed extremist groups, others whispered about government plots, and many simply confessed that they no longer felt safe leaving their homes. Meanwhile, the campus that had once been a place of learning now felt like the heart of a crime scene. Tape cordoned off large swaths of the quad, investigators combing the ground for shell casings, footprints, or anything the shooter might have left behind. The library steps where Alexander Price had collapsed remained eerily silent, save for the occasional click of a camera or the murmur of officers coordinating searches. Just hours earlier, that same space had been alive with conversation, debate, and laughter. Now it was a scar on the heart of the university, its very air heavy with grief and dread. Inside one of the dormitories, a group of students gathered in the lounge, unable to bear the isolation of their rooms. They sat in a circle, clutching mugs of untouched coffee, speaking in hushed tones. Some shared fragments of what they had seen, the flash of a weapon, the way people screamed, the sight of price falling. Others admitted they hadn't witnessed anything, but still couldn't shake the feeling that they had come too close to death. A tall student with tear-streaked cheeks said he had been waiting in line to ask Price a question just minutes before the shots rang out. "I can't stop thinking that if I had stayed longer, if I had walked a little slower, maybe it would have been me lying there." His words hung in the air like smoke, leaving the group silent, staring at the floor. As dawn approached, the sleepless campus awoke to a gray, somber light. The helicopters finally slowed, but the police remained, their presence a reminder of the danger that lingered. Reporters who had camped overnight outside the gates began their live broadcasts anew, their voices blending the language of mourning with that of investigation. Across the country, millions watched, waiting for the next update, hoping the manhunt would end. But the suspect remained out of reach. With every hour he eluded capture, his shadow grew larger, looming over classrooms, living rooms, and the national imagination. Parents debated whether to bring their children home from school. Professors hesitated to resume teaching. Even those who had never heard of Alexander Price now spoke of him, his death transforming him into a symbol of both loss and fear. For those who had known him personally, the grief was raw and unshakable. Friends described the hollow ache of knowing his voice would never again echo through their meetings or light up their group chats. To his supporters, he was more than a man, he was a movement silenced. To his critics, he was a polarizing figure whose death forced them to reckon with the cost of division. But to everyone who walked those darkened streets in Utah, he was now part of their history, a wound carved into their collective memory. And as the second night fell, the search stretched on, the suspect still nameless, faceless, free. Fear had seeped into every corner of the community, into every whispered conversation, into every glance over the shoulder. The tragedy was no longer just the death of a man, but the haunting uncertainty that followed. Until the gunman was found, no one could breathe fully, no one could heal. The sense of safety, once so ordinary, felt like a luxury lost forever.